Okay guys, so now we're going to start the long study part of the lecture. Before I get started, one of the big things that we've talked about in class that I want you guys to think of and be mindful of and use every time you do a long study, despite the fact that we don't have models anymore, or at least a live model, is you should have a piece of paper out that you can do little measurements to find, okay, there's the top of his head. This appears to be the bottom. So there's one head length, and now I can use that as a marker. And that's one head tall. And now I'll do one head wide. And that's one head wide. So I'll try and upload either a photo of the reference that I'm using, or I'll give you guys a link to the video that I took it from, and yeah, we'll go from there. Okay, I'm hopefully going to try and not be in the way on this, but I guess we shall see. So now that we've got our unit of measurement, put that off to the side. I think I'm going to draw in purple, or a bluish purple. Might be nice. And yeah, we'll get started. So first and foremost, now the pose I'm doing is a sitting pose, which is typically harder for younger artists. So don't feel like you have to draw this one, just because your units of measurements can get a little trickier, but we're still gonna kind of work through this as best we can. So I'm gonna start a timer. And my watch is dead, so that's probably not going to be too useful. Let's see. I guess I'll start a timer on maybe my stove or something. Okay, well, we have a timer going. I hope it works. So, now we're gonna get started. So first and foremost, he's got a bit of a tilt to his head. So, and guys, remember, staging's super important. So in this pose, if I were to drop a plumb line, if I were to rough this out, he's typically like doing something like this. Hand on, shoulders down, other shoulders coming out this way. So if I were to drop a plumb line through him, most of what I want to put on the page is going to be mainly on the right side of the screen. So I'm going to put his head about here. I'm not going to draw it too big because I don't want to have to redo this if I don't fit it all. So I'm going to draw it a little smaller. And I really want to try and get that angle in, because if I start with the right angle for the pose, it's going to set me off on the right page. Whereas if you guys remember when we were doing the skeletons, some people were trying to draw them straight up when they have a tilt to them. And if you're trying to correct what you're seeing with your own head, you're going to draw it wrong because you're not comparing it to something real. So it's very important that we use our pencil, get those lines in. Even if it helps you to box out that head, do it. Whatever method, like we teach you guys multiple ways to go about doing something, because some ways might be better for others than for other people. For some than others. Who needs speech when you can just hibernate in house all day? Okay, so I'm gonna try and get the jaw working here. So essentially, his face looks a little long, but he's got a bit of a long face anyway. So I'm gonna have his neck come out and maybe bring in that jaw a little bit. And for now, this is at least a good enough placeholder for me to be able to move on, but I do want to put in everything that we just talked about, which is that center line for where he's looking. So I'm trying to get that to read. So even if you have to include multiple center lines, like I can see the top of his head. So I'm gonna kind of make a note of that because it'll help me remind myself of what perspective I'm dealing with here. So now we're gonna try and do a nice line of action. I'm gonna pull it from the outside of his head and bring it around where I want his back to be, and then kind of pull it through. So it's a little wonky for line of action, but the point is you guys can use this to exaggerate and to really feel what you're trying to get out of that pose. Gestures and long studies are meant to be expressive. They're meant to make you really feel what the character is doing, where the weight is, you know, what does their pose tell you? So try and let that come through in your gestures. So now I'm going to build up with shape because he's very much he's got a lot of elements overlapping. So it's really important that we build up from what's kind of the bigger shapes and where they're leading us to. So I'm going to make a little hole for his neck just to see where that's coming from. And then I can find my center lines through there. You can connect your center lines throughout the entire body, you know, bringing it up through the neck, down to the chin, and through the head. So keep in mind that, you know, you have all these tools at your disposal. But just so it doesn't get confusing, I'm going to erase that a little bit. Okay. So now I'm looking at landmarks. So his shoulder, if his hand comes to be about here, and remember guys, we talk about placeholders so much. I'm not worried too much about getting anything perfect right now. All I'm focusing on is if I'm getting as much down as I can to give myself info for when I start getting into the nitty-gritty of each pose. So he's got a big deltoid or shoulder blade coming out. So we're gonna try and kind of get that in there. And we know that, you know, our pectorals are attached to our arms in a sense. So if his arm's coming out, it should stem from his pecs. So you can connect that line through. And now I'm going to drop a plumb line. I'm going to use his ear as some kind of marker. There we go. And so we're going to use his ear as some kind of marker, and I'm going to use my pencil to get a rough estimate of where that angle, what angle that shoulder blade's going to hit on, and then I'm going to use a separate angle from shoulder blade to shoulder blade. And now you have a cross point of intersection, and that's where I'm going to put his other arm. At this point, I'm going to recheck his back because it's starting to look a little wonky and big. So he's got a pretty straight line coming from the top of his back that kind of pretty much cuts right through the bottom of his ear. And then it curves off and it gets a little jagged a bit, and then it dips low. He's got a very like old man posture thing going on, so we want to try and encompass that. And now because he's sitting, I'm going to try and throw in the skirt pose shape that we talk about so often, just to get an idea of what kind of perspective we're looking at here. Now he's got a bit of a belly, and I think this technically comes out a little bit more, so I'm going to alter these things to make room for that. So most of the final aspects of your contour, your polishing stages, that comes at the end, like the last maybe 5 or 10 minutes of your long study. The biggest portion of time that you should be spending is figuring out where everything is, putting those placeholders in there, and once you feel confident that they're in the right places and they look proportionate, then you can move on to find the contour or smooth out that line, or really focus on your line proportion and line quality. That stuff is like fodder. You guys need the shapes, the building, and the doing all the legwork to figure out where everything is before you can start to really polish your drawings. And guys, a constant reminder, draw slower than you're going. I think everybody falls into this, myself included, where we draw a little too fast because we want to get stuff out. But it's so important to think before you draw and really think about where you're putting it and why you're putting it there. And if you've done the measurements and the checking to make sure you know why you're putting it there. So moving forward, before I run out of this 30-minute timer, we're at 21 minutes left apparently, just so everybody knows. I'm going to put a leg in here just to get the line. I'm not deciding where the knees are yet. And then I'm going to put another leg on this angle. And now we're going to drop a plumb line. His head pretty much goes through his knee, but his knee comes out a little bit wider than his head. So it should be about here for the first knee. And then now that we know where that knee is going to go, we can do a little line here, and now we know where the second knee is going to go. But we're going to double check this one for measurements. So I'm going to take this guy and I'm going to put it on my computer screen. Maybe I'll just turn it so you guys can see this better. Okay, so we're going to take this guy right here, and you're going to put him on your screen and then compare back and see how many of these heads tall is he in regards to his legs. And now you can compare back in so many other ways, guys. If anything, working off the computer should give you less of an excuse to do site measurement. The only thing is it's not going to prepare you as much for when you have to do it in person, where things are going to be a little bit different because it's more of a physically raising your arm, and some people struggle with that. But either way, there's no excuse not to do proportions now, because this thing is the easiest way to check. So just to double check, I think we're at, let me see, the first head width. So if we translate one head high, all right, so I think I'm drawing this guy really big based on that measurement. So I'm going to dial it back a little bit. And now we're going to do some head measurements to see how tall he is in general. 2, 3, 4. So he comes to be about 5 heads tall. So let's put that down here. And if you guys remember correctly, I love whenever we do the numbers, because it just makes everything so much easier. So there's number 2, number 3, number 4, and number 5. So with that being said, we're probably going to end up changing these legs quite a bit. So I'm going to take that head unit, pretty much from the small of his back, we have to the bottom of his torso. So this here is one head. And now I'm going to check his legs again. So it comes to right about where that elbow is going to be. So let's try and see if we can, and we'll drop another plumb line to see where the elbow lands, and it's pretty much the outside of the ear, which actually makes perfect sense because we don't really see this area. So if the elbow lands somewhere in that area, that means when we go to add the fleshy bits, you know, like the arm muscle and everything like that, it should make sense that this ends up being kind of like so.